What you're about to hear was originally published on the From This Day Forward podcast. As that podcast has been folded into this one, we're republishing the episode here on Northwoods Church Matters. We hope you enjoy it and are edified by it. God bless.
You're listening to Northwoods Church Matters, a podcast of Northwoods Church in Evansville, Indiana, where we discuss why the local church matters and things that matter to the local church. I'm your host, Matt Higgins. I've got two special guests that are here. I have got my bride, Dana Higgins, here on the podcast today. So, woo woo. I've also got Nellie Higgins here sitting beside me, who is our dog. She is a mix of a rat terrier and a corgi. She's an awesome dog, but she is attention needy. We often joke that she's our emotional support animal, but she needs emotional support. So, if you hear her barking or chirping or whining or something like that, that's just Nellie interceding in the podcast because she's emotionally needy. All right, so today we're going to talk about what is my bride's specialty. I've tried to get her on the podcast a couple times, but she wanted to make sure it was the right topic, and she gave this as the topic that she'd like to speak on, and she's just gotten an accreditation from ASCA, which is what?
The American School Counselor Association.
On grief and kids, and so this is a heavy topic. How do you talk to kids about spiritual stuff when somebody passes away, when somebody goes home to be with the Lord? How do you have that conversation? So let's start off. And the first question I've got for you today, Dana, is where do you encounter grief in your current job?
Normally it's with a student who loses a parent. They could lose a grandparent. It could also be a death of a relationship, like the parents divorcing. That's also seen as a time when kids can grieve, or a parent is incarcerated, or even a death of a pet.
Grief isn't necessarily totally related to when somebody dies. For example, I've been counseling a family who has been struggling with a family member who had Alzheimer's. And that's like a slow grief process, right, where somebody is slowly slipping away from the person that you used to know.
Right.
So what are some emotions that kids struggling with grief have?
Kids have a variety of different emotions. They can feel anger, they can feel guilt, they can maybe even feel relief, like you said, that if somebody who has been going through a process of passing away, of dying, and that finally the person has passed away, sometimes it can actually be a relief. But then there can also be fear that if one parent has passed away, will my other parent pass away? Or if one grandparent has passed away, will the other one? And there's some fear there of being left alone, and also obviously sad. So kids can have a ton of different emotions.
The relief one is a really hard one, right? Because I do know a lot of people that go through grief and they do feel that feeling of relief, but sometimes they feel shame or guilt themselves that they're feeling relief, that they should be more sad over the situation when maybe it's somebody who's going through a long-term process where they have cancer or things like that. So how do you help people that are struggling with the feeling of relief over somebody's dying?
I think sometimes it's just got to take time for that person to process, what has happened, and for them to be okay. But it's all going to be on their timing.
Affirming the feeling that it's okay.
Right.
Is good as well.
And I think it's also, sometimes we put a time limit that, you should be okay. And I won't ever forget when my mom passed away. I had a colleague when we were living up in Massachusetts who said, give it a year and you'll feel better. And after a year, yes, I felt somewhat better, but I almost took that to say, well, in a year, you'll be able to move on. You'll forget. You'll get beyond it. You'll get past it. And that wasn't the case. I mean, my mom's been gone over 20 years and I still miss her.
Yeah. So artificial time frames are kind of the enemy.
Right.
So what are some signs that kids might be struggling with grief? Because, kids aren't necessarily the most verbal or able to process emotions like an adult would. So how do you know that a kid is struggling with grief?
Well, I think it's okay for kids to kind of go in and out of grief where they're going to be feeling sad or they may feel fearful or any of those other emotions. But then also they may go back to playing video games or go back to playing sports or something like that. So they may be in and out of grief. But I think where they really struggle is when they have a prolonged or chronic depression, anger, the fear, the withdrawal, that it lasts over several months. I think that's when it becomes something more serious.
Yeah, and I think what you just said is important because I do know some parents that they struggle with the emotions of their kids and understanding them because they're in grief one moment and then another moment, like you said, they're playing video games or they're going out to play. I've had some parents that have processed that as, well, the kids aren't experiencing grief, or there's something broken in my kids that they're not expressing grief properly.
Again, it's okay for your kids to go in and out of grief, and the grieving is going to be the internal private emotions and feelings that the kids are having, but then the mourning is the outward appearance of the grieving. And sometimes when we don't see the mourning, the outward appearance, we think something is wrong or something is broken. When it's not, we all grieve. It's just in how we deal with the grief.
And that may be their way to cope, is some kids may be looking for something normal or a sense of normalcy, and going into video games or something like that might be their return to normalcy, or trying to cope with what's going on.
Right. Things that they enjoy doing, and that's okay.
Yeah. So don't take away things that your kids enjoy doing. I mean, there's a time for them to feel sad, but don't feel like they need to feel sad all the time, or if they're not sad all the time, then there's something wrong with your kids.
Correct.
Yeah. All right. So what are some helpful things that people can say to kids struggling with grief? We'll take helpful things first.
Helpful is always good first.
Yeah.
I think definitely just whoever the person may be is just for you to say, I'm sorry that this has happened, and to acknowledge it, and that you're there to help any way you can. I think that is probably one of the most helpful things you can say.
Yeah. What are some unhelpful things to say?
You've been grieving long enough. It's time to move on.
Yeah.
And I know when going through my training, there was a parent who recounted a teacher had told her at school, okay, it's been long enough. Your child needs to move on. And that was a very obviously unhelpful thing to say, because grief doesn't follow a timeline.
Yeah. I think setting up artificial timelines is never helpful. It's never helpful. Not in adults, not in kids. You don't get to say grief is over by now. I think another unhelpful thing to say to kids, honestly, is trying to figure out how to say this delicately, but intentionally lying to your children about things that are theological untruths that you really don't believe. Things that you will have to correct later, or things that later on in life, through going to church, they may discover are wrong.
Right, that are incorrect, not spiritually true.
Yeah. Dad's gone to heaven to become an angel. Or I guess God needed my dad more than I did.
Right.
Just weird things like that are just kind of niceties that you think are comforting your kids. But I've seen the after effects that in the long run, then you have to counteract those or correct those later in life. And they realize that you've intentionally lied to them to make them feel better. And they understand that.
Right.
It's almost like the Santa Claus syndrome. You lie to your children about Santa Claus for years. They find out it's not true. What? I'm sorry if you believe in Santa Claus and you're listening to that, and I've ruined your childhood. But I think it's unhelpful sometimes to say things that are not true to your children, and then you have to unwind them later on in life.
Right. And I do think, as far as sharing the details with kids, you've just got to determine what is okay for you to share with your kids. Obviously, you don't want to go into all the details, but I think also, depending on the child's age, you just can't say that, well, we lost them. Well, to a really young child, well, what do you mean you lost them? Aren't they coming back? So I think kids can be very literal. So I think use just concrete terminology with those kids, and do share some details, but without going into everything that happened to Grandma Jane.
Yeah. I mean, kids are concrete thinkers, and sometimes they have difficulty processing things that are metaphorical. Grandpa went home to be with the Lord,
or she's gone away,
or she's gone away.
Where did she go? When is she going to be back?
Right. Yeah. Isn't this home? Or when is she going to be back? And I know that as adults, often we shy away from the word died because it seems so final, but I think it's okay to use the word died. Right. You may have to explain what that means, but I think that's better sometimes than the metaphors for it.
Right, that they've gone away, because, again, you're setting up in your child's head, they've got the expectation, when are they going to be back? Why did they go? Is it something I did? And then blame themselves for that person going away potentially.
So what are some helpful things that people can do when kids are struggling with grief?
I think first and foremost, just allow time and support. You want to allow them time to grieve, time to be sad, time to have a range of different emotions and be an understanding of that, and to support them during the healing process, which it is a process. It's going to take time. I think also it's helpful for parents or whoever it may be to still follow routines, because sometimes I think we feel like something tragic has happened or something sad has happened, so I need to let my kid do whatever they want to do because you feel sorry for them. But really what your kid still needs is that daily routine and the daily structure.
And sometimes it helps parents too. You get back into routine and it just helps get back to a sense of normalcy.
Well, and I think it's also you're providing safety and security.
Yeah.
And as much as sometimes we feel like, kids are fighting against that safety and security and the boundaries, that's what they really long for, is for that structure, for that routine. It helps them feel safe to have some normalcy and to know this is what's going to happen next.
So what are some unhelpful things to do?
Don't indicate that the child should just get over it. Don't act as if nothing has happened. And I think don't say things like, it could be worse. You still have one brother. Or, I know how you feel. Because I think we have a tendency where we feel bad and we just want to say, I know how you feel, but no, you don't. Everybody grieves their own way. Or to say, you'll be stronger because of this.
Sometimes I feel like we lean on pat answers because we want to be helpful. We want to fill the void. We want to say something. And then we go to some of these things that we've heard that are just kind of pat answers or just basic statements. And some of them are just either not helpful or not true. I think as people grieve, we can be James 1:19 people, and we can be slow to speak and quick to listen. And when we're slow to speak, maybe we shouldn't say that pat thing that actually is just a troublesome thing to say. I've never heard anyone say, well, you've got another brother, but I have heard people say when their spouse dies, oh, you can get married again.
Right.
Or you're still young, you can get married again. Oh, my word.
Yes. Sometimes it'll just, you want to shake your head over some things that people say sometimes.
Yeah, and I don't think that people are mean-spirited in
Right.
saying those things. It's just that they want to fill the silence with something, and sometimes silence is better than saying something stupid. Yeah, you can tweet me on that. Sometimes silence is better than saying something stupid. And I think another helpful thing to do really is to remember your loved one in positive ways.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it's hard for kids when adults say, we're not going to speak of the deceased again, or we're not going to talk about this because selfishly I feel bad about the situation. But you may not be helping out your child by not speaking about it. I mean, often the best thing to do is to remember the good times, remember good things, or have a time where you can all commemorate or go to a graveside or go somewhere, place that your loved one enjoyed together as family, and then do those things and then spend some time remembering good things that you thought about that loved one. Is counseling for a child okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think sometimes they need it, especially when it becomes more of a chronic issue and they're maybe having trouble sleeping at night or trouble focusing and concentrating and kind of getting back in the swing of school. Counseling is needed, and that is okay.
And it's not a parental failure.
Right.
I mean, often
Absolutely.
parents think it's a parental failure if my kid needs counseling, and that's just not true. Sometimes we're all a team here. And sometimes there are just things that are beyond your expertise. And so there have been times where parents have brought a child to me to talk about death or other things just because they're struggling how to theologically deal with something or how to answer a question. And Bobby or Darren or whoever it is has been able to answer that question and talk with that child about that. Do you have experience with kids that they're experiencing death for the first time, and then they are concerned about themselves dying?
Sure. Especially, I think it's in the younger kids more so than older ones. But I definitely think, the younger kids, because they're wondering what happened to this person and is it going to happen to me?
Yeah. And for that situation, it's a good gospel sharing opportunity, right?
Right.
And so what I would do with that is run to the gospel. And I think parents correctly often do that. And there can be worry and fear in younger kids about, am I going to die next? Or especially if it was a surprise or something that was very sudden. And so use that as an opportunity to say that we all sin, we all rebel against God, but God is a loving God and he wants to have a relationship with us. And he sent Jesus to rescue us from our sin. And if we believe in Christ, we'll have eternity with him and we will have everlasting life. And so death becomes something that we don't fear, because to live is to Christ and to die is gain. And, that is a hard thing for kids to understand, but I think it's a good opportunity to share the gospel, that this is what we believe.
Right. And I think, again, it's a conversation between the parent or the grandparent or whoever the child is living with, for them to have that conversation to say, I'm grieving too, I'm sad, and experiencing some of the same emotions, because you don't want the kid to feel isolated, or you don't want to feel like, I have to be strong for my child, so I've got to hold in my grief. And I think it's okay for the two to come together and to say, I'm sad too, and I also miss your mom, or I also miss granddad.
When you look at the Gospels, and when Paul is talking about his thorn in the flesh in 2 Corinthians, he talks about that he prayed to God to have this thorn of the flesh removed, and yet God didn't do it. And so in his processing, he talks about that in his weakness, Christ is strong, that Christ abounds in his own weakness. And so it's okay to be weak. And so in these situations where there is hardship, I don't think you have to be strong. I think that's a very cultural notion. For some reason, as Americans, we think that we have to be strong.
Right.
Or as parents or the big people, we have to hold ourselves together. Something that you can do well for your children is to grieve well and show your emotions and show your sadness. There are some times where you have to put your big boy pants on and you have to say, we're going to get in a routine, or we're going to go to dinner, or we're going to go to the sports event, or do those things. But that doesn't preclude you from having emotions about things.
Right.
So how do you help kids that are anxious about funerals or other ceremonies about death?
It can definitely benefit to come together to honor the person who died and receive support, to definitely explain what is likely to occur. So you want to kind of give that child an idea of what may occur at the funeral, or just overall a general idea of the process. And I think they should be invited to participate at the level that they wish. So, that could be picking out flowers for the funeral. It could be the program that is passed out at the funeral. So giving them some ownership and participation in their comfort level of what they're going to do or how they're going to participate in the funeral. But then I think also having another adult, which may or may not be a family member, could be a friend. So if that child decides to attend the funeral, but then they feel uncomfortable, for that friend to then just have that child leave with them and just go outside or go to a different spot in the church or wherever the funeral is being held, just to kind of get away. So for that adult to be sensitive to the kid's needs.
Do you think that we should be telling kids to move on from grief?
No. And like I've said before, no, I think for us to tell somebody to move on from grief is we're doing them a disservice and we're not showing compassion.
Yeah, I think setting a false time frame is like the worst mistake that you can make when dealing with grief on any level. Right. There are adults that I have dealt with a spouse that has passed away, and they'll often tell me like they hear a creak in the hallway, and it feels like to them that their spouse is going to be coming down the hallway, or there's a certain taste or certain smell or a certain song that comes on the radio and it brings back certain memories of a loved one. You never really lose a sense of grief.
With the snow that we have outside right now, making snow cream with my mom was one of my favorite things to do as a kid. So just thinking about that, or the color yellow sticks out in my mind. So there are different things that I may be unexpecting, more so than like Mother's Day or Christmas or the date of her death. It could just be anything that day that may just pop out at me. Mm-hmm. That makes me remember her.
And I think what to do with those things is to celebrate those things. Right. I think if the color yellow was important to your mom, then you shouldn't just like ban all yellow things from your house.
Exactly.
That's just a weird thing. And I know that people do weird stuff like that. Like I can't eat this anymore because it reminds me of my dad.
Right.
That's so hard to say I'm going to be offended every time that somebody serves duck at the dinner table that is going to remind me of Dad, and we can never eat duck again. I think the way to process that properly is to think of it in a good manner, that you're remembering in a good light Grandpa whenever you eat the duck, or remembering your mom in a positive manner whenever you see the color yellow, or snow cream. I mean, that's something that you passed on to you and our daughter Gwen, is that's something that you guys do together. So you can pass on those traditions to other people. So as a counselor, I've found that there's a lot of people willing to help people right after someone dies. But as time passes, the number of people helping diminishes. How can Christians help grieving kids in the months or the years after somebody dies?
Yeah, I think just staying in contact with them is really important. Again, like we've said, that there's no timeline for grieving and that the hurt will end. It's ongoing. So I think just for us as Christians to stay in contact with those people, to check in and ask, hey, how are you doing? I'm thinking about you. It may be texting a song. It may be texting scripture to them. It could be getting together for a cup of coffee and, hey, just checking in. How are you doing? So I think to know that it's not a fixed amount of time, that we get over the grief, and just to continue to provide compassion and support.
There's a lot of people that are around people right after somebody dies. At a funeral, visitation, over to the house, dropping off food, etc., almost to the point that a lot of people are just kind of overwhelmed by the number of people that are around.
Feel smothered.
You feel smothered and overwhelmed by all this stuff, and you wish people would just kind of leave you alone, although you understand that they're there to help. And then there comes a point where it's almost like everybody's gone. And that's when you really need people the most, because that time right after somebody dies, I mean, the wheels are in motion. You're spinning. I mean, you have to pick out caskets. You have to pick out flowers. You have to pick out all the information that goes into the bulletin for the funeral service. You have to pick out the order of the funeral service. And it's just a go sense of, there's this to do and that to do and this to do. And I'll pick out pictures, and it's like you just don't stop. And then you finally do stop, and then silence.
What's next?
What's next? How do I deal with next? I think one of the best things you can do as a Christian is weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice, as Scripture says, that there are people that need somebody to weep with them, not necessarily tell them to move on or get over it or here's some things to move past it, but they need people that are conscientiously sitting with them and weeping with them and sharing time with them in the days and the years and the months afterwards, especially kids.
Right. So moving on, how can believing parents help their kids understand what happens when we die?
I think just continually preaching the gospel. I think often parents make a mistake by protecting kids from the topic of death, when really what they're doing is, when death suddenly happens in the family, it starts generating all these questions for kids. And I think it's okay to talk about death before that actual event happens, because it's a part of the gospel. The truth from Romans 6:23 that we've all sinned and the wages of sin is death, that's a concept that we should be teaching to our kids. It may be not as concrete for them, especially when they're much younger kids, but I don't think that there's any reason to shy away from that. I think that we should be talking about the gospel continually. I mean, if we're Deuteronomy 6 parents, if we're loving the Lord our God with all our heart and mind and soul and strength, and then continually trying to share about God with our kids, the gospel is important to that. And the fact that when we die apart from Christ, we don't get to heaven, I mean, that is a part of the gospel. And I think we give the bare bones of that to our kids and help them to understand this is what happens. And then what is a better opportunity to share the gospel or talk about the gospel than when somebody that is close to your family or somebody in your church or somebody that you know dies? And your kids are going to ask questions. So I think it's time then to answer the questions. Don't say, we don't talk about death, or we don't talk about that in our house. I think it's okay to say, I don't know the answer to that. Let's go talk to Pastor Bobby or Pastor Matt or Pastor Darren.
Right.
I think it's better to talk to a pastor or have your kids talk to a pastor versus giving fictional answers or half-truths or things like that. And we're there to answer those questions. I mean, I've talked numerous times with kids who had questions about heaven or questions about death or those type of things. And it's not uncommon, and your kid's not broken if they like talking about death or they won't have lots of questions about death. That doesn't make them weird. That just makes them curious children.
Right. And I think it's almost like, if they're coming to you and they're talking about a boyfriend breakup or a girlfriend breakup or, something else, and sometimes we want to put our fingers in our ears and go, la, 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 and not listen to them. I think that is an awesome, marvelous, wonderful time for us to build that relationship with our kids, is to just be quiet and listen. Listening is one of the most powerful tools that we have. How do parents deal with grief or worry about someone that dies apart from Jesus?
Yeah, this is a tough one. I mean, this is really, really hard. I think that you can say some honest things from Scripture. I think you can go to Jeremiah 17:9, which talks about who can understand the heart. Or you can talk about the story of David being picked by Samuel to be the next king, where it is said that only God can see the heart and only God can understand the heart. I think that there are much more situations that are out there where a spouse has concerns about whether their partner knows the Lord versus situations where a spouse just outright knows that my husband was an atheist and he's dying apart from Christ and he's consigned to hell because of that. And I think in those situations, it's okay just to say, this is what the gospel says happens to people who believe in Jesus. But as for your dad or your granddad or grandma or whoever it may be, lean on those verses that say, look, only God knows the heart of a person, and only God can see the inside. And only God knows whether this person has made a genuine heart change. Only God knows whether the Spirit of the Lord resided in them because they had given their life to Jesus. Only God knows if somebody is a new creation. Now, we can tell somewhat by fruit, but fruit is often deceptive. And so I think it's okay to say, my hope and my desire is that Grandpa is in heaven and he'll be there. But I don't know the heart, and only God knows. And then put the onus on them. Look, if you want to go to heaven and spend eternal life, then it's important to have a relationship with Jesus. Use it as an evangelism opportunity. But that is just super, super hard. Now, what I think is a huge mistake, just a huge mistake that parents make. Bobby and I often talk about, we have never attended a funeral where the person who died isn't going to heaven. Everybody in every funeral that we do, somebody gets up and says, he's going to heaven.
Because he's a good person.
Because he's a good person. Don't make the mistake of betraying the gospel that you believe in just to make somebody feel better. Because I think that it's a mistake to say to a child, look, your dad is going to heaven because he's a good person.
Right. Or because he did a bunch of good works. Salvation is not based on works.
Yeah. I mean, if the situation lies and I don't know, just say, I don't know. And that's an okay thing to say. Just say, only God sees the heart. Only God judges the heart. Only God knows whether somebody's a new creation. And we'll have to wait until the next life to find out. And you can even say that for the parent who was clearly an atheist and wanted to have nothing to do with Jesus. I think that's an appropriate thing to say. Now, I also think it's a horrible thing to say, your dad's burning in hell right now. I mean, that's of course not a bad thing. But I don't think that anybody says that. I mean, on everybody at a funeral seems to run to this good person morality stuff that is not the gospel.
Right.
And I think that's just a huge mistake, because you're setting yourself up later in life for a situation where you have to correct something that you said that is knowingly not true. And I've seen some kids that have turned away from the Lord in their teenage years because of that. Mom, you said that dad was in heaven because he was a good person, and now you're telling me that you don't know? I mean, what sort of Jesus do we believe in? Or it has all sorts of questions about that.
Right. And mom's theology, to be honest, may be messed up as well.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And that may be true. But I think that all you can do as a parent is just stay truthful to the gospel. Share the gospel and use it as an evangelism opportunity, which is kind of the approach that we take as pastors to when we preach a funeral for someone where we don't know whether that person is going to heaven or hell or what their eternal destination is. Just preach the gospel. Just share what we know is true. Leave the I don't knows to God.
Right.
And it's okay to say, I don't know. So what advice would you give to a parent whose kid is grieving? What is the best things that you can recommend that they do immediately?
Definitely have a couple of resources.
Sure, go ahead.
That I can give you. One is grievingstudents.org, an excellent website that you can use. But then also there's the Doogie Center, which has a ton of different material on grieving. So I always think those are two good resources to give to families. But I think just loving your kid and being compassionate and talking to them, setting those routines and boundaries, not hiding your own emotions. And I think just paying attention to signs because, like we've said before, when it becomes a chronic issue where they're just obsessing over the person's death, when they start talking about, I wish I could just be with that person, and they're beginning to make some suicidal gestures or comments, I think that's when it starts to amp up how important it is to start looking into some help for that child. And I think also not just for the child, but that's where the parent can come alongside and go to counseling with their child. I think that would be important. Sometimes we think, well, we can just pass the child off to the counselor and say, well, let the counselor deal with that. But I think you're also grieving too. So I think it can be you, the counselor, your child, all three of you, or as a family, maybe it's a loss of a sibling and the family needs to go to therapy together. That's okay. Sometimes I think, counseling can be very taboo. That's only for people with mental health issues, but it's not.
Yeah, but that's an important point, is that counseling should not be taboo, especially biblical counseling. Biblical counseling is you're working with someone who is going to tell you what God says about certain issues that are going on with life. And the Bible is not theoretical. The Bible intersects with real everyday issues. And does the Bible have a lot to say about grief? Absolutely. Thanks for tuning in to the Northwoods Church Matters podcast. If you'd like to find out more about Northwoods Church, you can visit us at our website, www.northwoodschurch.org. Again, that's www.northwoodschurch.org.